When I was asked to speak, I was asked to speak about the scope of the community justice activities in the province now, how these got started, this set of initiatives, and what the future will hold. But as I look around the room, there are so many people that could be at this podium giving exactly the same address. There are so many in the room that are really the heart and soul of the work that goes on. Excuse me, day in and day out in the communities. So I will beg your indulgence as I talk a little about the programs that all of you work so hard to create, achieve, and move into the future. It begs the question, though, as we start, and I really am thankful for Val's remarks about, well, what is community justice, and what are some of the key elements, what are the key thoughts that we need to keep in mind when we're having this conversation. I think from just a department point of view, when we talk about community justice, we talk about the relationship we have with communities that undertake to provide services to resolve conflict in those communities and better serve needs of offenders and victims. How did we get here? Well, I think there's been a number of parallel developments over the last 15 years. Not all of them uniquely Saskatchewan, but certainly some of them uniquely Saskatchewan. The first I'd speak to are the legal changes that have occurred. Since the 1980s, there's been a number of changes within the criminal code. The first series of those changes really respected the role that victims have in the criminal justice system. And that was a tremendous impetus, at least for us here in Saskatchewan, to start rethinking about some of the relationships that we have with community and how we wanted to organize services for people in communities. Clearly, the criminal code changes in 1996 with the sentencing amendments and the inclusion of adult alternative measures helped greatly in establishing community justice programs. And again, we see a lot of that philosophy taken into the more recent Youth Criminal Justice Act. I think the second development really was the interest in the criminal justice system itself to make some fundamental change with respect to how services could be delivered and how voices could be heard in the process of resolving conflict. You see some of that reflected in the early diversion policies in this province that are almost 10 years old now, and in movements such as First Nations policing that Rick spoke about this morning right across the country. But I think the third and perhaps maybe the greatest impetus for the change to community justice is occurred within the interests that the communities themselves have in being players within a system of resolving conflict at a community level. And I think it's this desire to create social order and to resolve conflict that has really been the main impetus for the changes that we're seeing. And it will be the driver as we move forward into the next round of changes that we're all here to talk about over the next couple of days. So I think clearly in Saskatchewan, by the 1990s, the mid-1990s, you'd seen this convergence of community interest and government willingness to proceed with a different path. And this development of community-based approach. So why is this different? What's the promise of this? I think Val has given us some very good conceptual framework of some of the framework that's available that isn't available in the traditional criminal justice system. I mean, first, community work tends to be more broadly conceptual than resolving matters through a court process. It has the opportunity to be holistic in meeting the needs of the victims and in responding to the needs of the offenders in the community. And it speaks really to a social justice model. And we've heard that echoed, I think, through the remarks of other speakers today, that there needs to be an integrated approach, a social justice model, if we're actually able, in a long-term way, to resolve a lot of the conflict. The challenge clearly is how to bring that fundamental change to the communities, but for the communities, with communities finding the models and the directions that are truly their own, and will actually make that fundamental difference. I think that's where this commission has been so important. It recognized the importance of a social justice model and the process that was already occurring. I'm going to quote a little bit, just one of the comments that the commission made in the final report. In talking specifically about community justice approaches, the report says there are many personal and program successes. There are numerous programs operating in communities throughout Saskatchewan that effectively deal with harm caused by offending behavior, thereby preventing further victimization. Responses based on First Nations and Métis culture are being used successfully in some communities. Alternative to the formal justice system and new programs within the justice systems are in place. The Commission sees these programs as a major step toward making justice more fair and reasonable. So the Commission recognized that this was a very important path that many of the communities was on, and certainly in a few minutes we'll hear about some examples of that from Joseph. But what are these? When we refer to these, what exactly do we mean, and what are exactly the initiatives from the provincial government for adults? Now, I actually have brought along some handouts that describe very briefly some of these programs. They're on the table right there in the front. So if you're interested, at the end of the presentation, you could grab one of these, or if you're really interested, you could go on the Justice website or talk to me or some of my colleagues who are here.